We're going to start off with Michael Orbach. Michael had a very distinguished career at Duke University as the head of the Duke Marine Lab, and he recently retired. He now lives in Santa Cruz. He's worked on coastal issues all around the world. And then we're going to follow with Deborah. And Deborah is the executive officer, executive director of the California Ocean Protection Council, and she's deputy secretary for oceans and coastal policy in the California Natural Resources Agency. So we have two very experienced people, one who's going to give more of the global view, and one is going to talk about what we're doing here in California. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Orbach.
I'll just reemphasize that I'm a cultural anthropologist, and so if I start to talk about natural science, you can hit me up the side of the head after the talk. I did have fun at the Duke Marine Lab. I think I'm the only social scientist who's been a director of a lab full of natural scientists. That was a great deal of fun, actually. Let's see. Okay, we've got it up here. As I said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm going to talk tonight about how humans look at coasts and oceans. Because in fact, the premise here is that the way we think culturally about our relationship with coasts and oceans turns into political economy and ultimately into public policy. And so we have to think about how we think about coasts and oceans, because that turns into how we behave about coasts and oceans. Culture turns into political economy that drives public policies. That's why, to me, the issue is not a technical or scientific problem, it's a human values problem. All right, the two major demographic trends in the world today, and they have been at least for most of the last century, are movements to cities and movements to coasts. They're inexorable, they're not going to stop. This is where people are going. And of the 30 mega cities in the world, over 20 million population, of the 30 of them, 20 are in low-lying coastal areas. There are literally tens of thousands, if not millions, of small villages and cities that are in low-lying coastal areas, and billions of hectares of what I call natural infrastructure, mangrove swamps, Spartina marshes, the things that Jerry referred to a minute ago, all of which will be threatened by this phenomena. This is the big train wreck. Locomotives heading to each other on the same track, coastal development, and sea level rise. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the science at all, but you've probably seen this diagram before in this series. This is the last IPCC estimate of sea level rise. Now, this is a consensus estimate. They had to get, what, 1,600 or something scientists from around the world agree. And it says, well, sort of the middle of that's maybe it might be up to a meter, right? This is what happens when you don't demand consensus. This is a survey by Parrish of reputable scientists who work on this issue from around the world, and you can see that their estimate is almost twice as high, the highest estimate, as the IPCC report, in the range of the 2 meters that Jerry was talking about earlier. Now, here's the important point that environmentalists hate when I bring it up. There is nothing that humans can and will do between now and 2100 that will stop a sea level rise of approximately 2 meters by 2100. The systems are too big, the timescales are too great. We started screwing up the world too long ago, middle 1800s basically. We cannot stop the first 2 meters of sea level rise. Now, as Jerry points out, it's going to continue. We may be able to slow it down after that at some point. Now, that does not mean that we shouldn't drive Priuses. It doesn't mean Al Gore is basically a good guy. But it means that for all the reasons we have to reduce our carbon footprint, this isn't one of them. This is going to happen no matter how we behave. And so we are, in Jerry's words, going to have to adapt. Now, here's a sampling of what some of the places in the world look like. Recognize this place? What is that? That is Manhattan, the island of Manhattan in New York, at 4 meters. And as Jerry said, it's not going to stop at 2 meters. It'll probably get to 4 sometime in the next century. That's New York at 4. This is South San Francisco Bay all of this blue area, which is currently land, will be watered. That's at 1 meter, 1 meter. This is South Florida at 5 meters. This is Lake Okeechobee, which is now a lake. It'll be part of the ocean. Miami's right down here. Actually, Miami's right down here. So it's basically up to Gainesville-ish, and here's Tampa Bay up here. That's right. This is Waikiki. How many have been to Waikiki? All right, so the Royal Hawaiian is right about here. Right about here, I'm sorry. Here's the Alawai Canal, you know, where all the canoes go and stuff like that. So here is the blue here. University of Hawaii is up here. This is the area that will be inundated at 1 meter. And I point out that the city of Honolulu waste treatment plant is in blue area right off the map right here. Okay? So this is kind of the scale. And in fact, there's a nice website called Sync My City. And if you haven't done it, you can go on and you can, whatever city you like, you can sync it like this. It's kind of fun. So that's kind of the nature of some of the futures. Now, as Jerry said, this is an unusual problem because never before in modern human history, that is when we've had significant infrastructure, have we faced this problem. So you've probably seen this. Gary Griggs probably showed this one to you, if not other people. And what Jerry pointed out earlier was that human infrastructure has developed basically in the last 5,000 or 6,000 years in this period right here of essentially relatively constant sea level after this large rise from after the last glacial maximum when all the water was tied up in ice. So not only have we built all our infrastructure here, but all of our law and policy for public trust issues like public trust waters as opposed to privately owned land, and when one goes to the other and under what circumstances, all of this has developed from the old Roman civil law filtered by the English common law, which ends up in the law that we have today in this country. It's all been developed on the presumption that the sea's going to stay where it is, and it's not going to, which means we're not only going to have to rethink where we live, we're going to have to rethink the basic rules of law that we live by. That is going to be a huge job, which is why we need to get started, as Jerry pointed out. Now, what I'm going to do is take us around the world briefly here. First to Europe. It's had a long history of this question of coastal threats, let's just say. Then I'm going to talk about the United States a little bit, and finally Asia. And my point is going to be that each of those political cultures in these places has looked at this question differently over time and reacted to it differently over time in a very different way. I'm going to show you how that's true. So let's look at Italy. First of all, long history of coastal engineering and arming. If you've ever been to the Mediterranean, travel around a little bit, or up the Thames in England, you'll see there's a lot of hardened stuff. That's what they did. They hardened the shoreline, built on it, sometimes built out into the ocean, although not a tremendous amount, but they hardened a lot of stuff over the last several thousand years. Current engineering solutions are in play. I'm going to show you one of them. But it's been in this context of relatively homogeneous cultures and political economies in this region. You recognize the picture in the upper left? You recognize where that is? St. Mark's Square in Venice. This is on a normal high tide in St. Mark's Square, where the water is up to your waist. That's not the way it was designed to be in St. Mark's Square. Now, Venice sits at the top of here's Venezia, top of the Venice Lagoon, and some barrier islands here in the Mediterranean, and they have 3 major inlets. Well, their solution to this at the moment, Venice is a particular problem because it's sinking as well for a variety of reasons. So now basically everybody lives on the 2nd floor in Venice, not the 1st floor. So what they're going to do is they're going to build these tide gates. And so the lagoons this side, oceans this side, these are big concrete troughs in the bottom. These are hinged here. They're big steel, empty steel sections that when they flood with water will sit down in the concrete, and when they blow the air out, will come up, and essentially they're going to try to stop the tide from rising in Venice Lagoon. Right? Now this may or may not work at all. And by the way, the original estimate was about $3 billion. It's now cost over $20 billion, and at least 20 million of which went to the mayor of Venice, who's now in jail. But besides that, I was on a committee with the chief engineer at this at one meeting, and I asked him, kind of off the record, I said, you know, when y'all were designing this, which is in the 80s, it's how long it takes to get it done, did you consider sea level rise? And he said, well, he said, you know, it wasn't really an issue when we started, but about 10 years into the planning, we said, well, let's calculate how long it's going to work if sea level rises. And he said, we figure it'll work up to about 1 meter. So, yeah, give them an extra 20 years, right, before it won't work. So, but that's what they're doing right now. In fact, the project is just, the first of the gates is just finishing now. You can Google it online. It's fun to follow the history as it unfolds. So, let's go to the Germany and Netherlands. Now, northern Germany, if you've ever been to the Netherlands or to northern Germany especially on the North Sea side, and also the Baltic side, but particularly the North Sea side around a little town called Emden up there, they have a long, long history of trying to protect their country from the ocean. 40% of the Netherlands is below sea level. 40%, almost half the country, right? And it's protected in various ways I'm going to show you in a minute. A lot of bottom-up approaches, that is, these were the Hanseatic League and the city-states, and there weren't a lot of federal governments for most of their history, but they built up these systems from the ground up from local communities, and again, relatively homogeneous cultures and political economies. So in the 50s, shortly after the Second War, there were a series of storms that bridged what dikes they had in the Netherlands and caused the flooding behind them, as you see here. And the results of this was a system of dikes and barriers. You see all these little red lines here. Those are all barriers, essentially enclosing the whole coast, except for this one, the estuary here, of the Netherlands. Now, all the areas in brown are what are called their polder areas. These are areas that were developed and on which communities and industries were put after the barriers were completed. Okay, so this is new land, essentially. People call it reclaimed land. This is the barrier here, is the southern barrier, which is down right here, actually. And it can open and close, actually, as they see fit with tides and floods and various things. The water coming from the land is almost as troublesome sometimes as water going from the ocean. So they put this barrier in. By the way, my wife and I have traveled here quite extensively, and everyone comes up to us and thanks us for the Marshall Plan, which built these southern barriers, actually, after the Second War. Now, I'll get back to where they are right now in a minute. But here is the town of Emden, and it is actually right here in Germany, just as you go across this estuary into Germany. It's a nice little port city. It's where all the Volkswagens ship to the U.S., and they have this very large barrier berm around the entire city. So this is the harbor of Emden here, and the level of the harbor of Emden is 5 meters above the mean sea level in the North Sea, which is right here. Now, the reason it's that way, and it's a series of locks that you see in the middle here, that take the ships from here, there's a ship right there, up to the harbor, which is 15 feet higher. The reason it's there, those berms, is that one of the things they did over the last 1,500 years, because the nasty Frisians from the west kept attacking them, is they built up these berms around, outside of which were low-lying areas, so they could basically flood the enemy out and maintain themselves in their city behind the berms. The artifact of it is that these people are pretty well inured for at least a couple of meters of sea level rise for an entirely different reason. They've got a locked system that's got them 15 feet above sea level, you know, so history can help you out sometimes in mysterious ways. And the Netherlands is looked at as one of the most successfully defended coasts in the world. This is the Dutch ambassador to the United Nations in 2012 presenting a new report called Living with Water. And as you can see, she says, we can no longer defend our coasts in the era of rising sea levels. we are in fact going to have to live with water. That's code for move. So the Netherlands plan, consulted by all, fed by all the latest engineering and science, has them abandoning about 20% of this polder area you see in brown here. So they get it. In fact, I had to laugh. Mary Landros, who's a senator from Louisiana right after Katrina, went to the Netherlands, came back and said, we're going to be just like the Netherlands, by which she meant the dikes. And I actually sent her office the report from this. I said, we should be just like the Netherlands, but not for the reason you think. Okay, so that's enough of that. So, okay, the United States. Well, rapidly, we didn't have the 1,000 years of adaptation, 2,000, 3,000 like Europe and Germany and the Netherlands had. Relatively large-scale development in the last 100 to 150 years. Relatively few real tests of durability of the kind that the North Sea gave the Netherlands that caused them to build their system. What I call heterogeneous cultures and political economies, largely because the states are so powerful in the United States compared to the federal government, the so-called federalism. But we got religion in the 60s and 70s. The San Francisco airport, Manhattan Island, large parts of Miami, New Orleans, Houston, all built in low-lying areas, a lot of times just filling right out into the ocean. We used to do it all the time. That's what the San Francisco airport is, what most of Oakland and Richmond is in the San Francisco Bay Area. We used to build out in the ocean all the time until the 70s, when we got religion, passed all these environmental laws, and basically stopped doing it. This is good, generally, that we did. And it was a little top-down. I mean, the states didn't all vote for this, except for the fact that they voted for the laws. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Fishery Conservation Management Act, the update of the OCSLA and the Ports and Harbors Act. We basically stopped as a matter of public policy because of a shift in perception of our relationship to the environment. It was really abrupt. Our development was much more abrupt than Europe, and our response was much more abrupt, actually, than Europe as well. However, there are still problem areas. So this is, I'm sure many of you have been to New Orleans. So we see New Orleans up here, and one of the things that is characteristic here is that New Orleans is in a bowl. It is on, the city of New Orleans is on an average 6 feet below the water next to it. And there are two bodies of water, Lake Pontchartrain here and the Mississippi River here. As you can see, the Mississippi River is even higher than Lake Pontchartrain, and New Orleans is in a bowl, which is why when Hurricane Katrina came and some of the dikes like this that were breached in the city of New Orleans, this happened. This is Canal Street here in New Orleans after Katrina with the terrible flooding there. Now, one interesting artifact is if you drive down, here's New Orleans, you drive down here, down toward what they call the Bird's Foot, which is the delta, the Mississippi River goes out into the Gulf of Mexico. Here, you drive along this levee, the road goes along here, and it's pretty rural, but there are a lot of Port Fourchon, major oil facility for offshore oil, is in this low area. You'll be driving along here, and this levee is about 15 feet high from the level of the ground here. You will see a 500, 600, 700-foot oil tanker going along in this thing 15 feet above where you're driving. And you think to yourself, what's wrong with this picture? And the answer is the whole hydrology of southern Louisiana has been hugely altered to keep the port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River navigation going, to the point where the river, at many points in its lower reaches here, is much higher than almost all the surrounding land. It's been engineered that way. Now, here's the problem. I had the fortune to be on, for the last 3 years, on the Science and Engineering Board, which oversaw the development of the newest Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. And this is funded in part by Deepwater Horizon money, so they had piles of money. This is the kind of science, frankly, that needs to be done everywhere, soon, in this country and everywhere. And what it shows is this. So here is New Orleans here. Lake Pontchartrain, the Mississippi River comes down here. Here's the bird's foot I talked about down here. Now, what this shows is that at 1 foot, so this, all the area here that's in some color is now land. It shows that at 1 foot, all of the red is underwater. I think I'm reading it correctly. Put my glasses on here. At 2 feet, the darker is underwater. And at 3 feet, which is probably going to occur around 2050, 2060, this much of Louisiana, southern Louisiana is underwater. This is Baton Rouge, an hour-and-a-half drive from New Orleans. And there's a natural geological scarf that comes right along here. And basically everything below that is essentially going to be gone in the next century. Now here are the way the science plays out on this. So this is just after Katrina, a new agency was created, the CPRA, Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, that requires these 5-year plans to be done, on which I worked on the second one. So here's a chart, and the reason I put this up, just focus on this, the sea level rise. In the first plan that came out in 2012, this is what they assumed about what the sea level rise was going to be, right, in terms of feet, right, 1.8 feet, 1.5 something feet. Here's what we assumed in the second one that came out in 2017, 5 years later. This is the way all the science is going on this. Every time we get new data, new information, the estimates go up. But this is still low compared to most of the current scientific estimates, but it's the highest number we could politically get into the document, right? Okay. So now here is, so this is a series of diagrams, and this is a comparison they're making, future without action, no action, and future with action. And I'm going to snapshot this over the next 50 years. This is science that could be done for every coastal area and could and should be done for California. Take note, Deborah, right? Yes, with your Ocean Protection Council. All right, so this is 10 years out. You're going to see here the years out, 10 years out. And the red is, so in this one, the red is salt marsh, the orange you can see is brackish marsh. So this is all a biological assessment of what the biological characteristics will be, right? This is after 10 years, after 20 years, after 30 years, after, come on, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it, after 40 years, and after 50 years. Now you note two things. The character of the vegetation that is left in each interval changes, but almost all of it disappears, right? Now, here's a comparison. Their solution to this at the moment, the hardened solutions, are to create what they call diversions. And remember I said the Mississippi River is higher than everything else? Well, their theory is that the problem is it's sediment starved, because all the sediment's now going down the Mississippi instead of, the delta of the Mississippi River used to go from Biloxi, Mississippi to Cameron, Louisiana, almost the Texas border. There's a huge, huge estuary there. Well, now it's all been funneled down into one channel, Mississippi River. So their solution is diversions. They're going to basically break holes in the levees and let water and sediment out. And they know this won't fix anything. And here's the evidence. So the diversion is going to be right about here. You see there's a little black line right here. That's where one of the diversions is going to be. So this is the future without action. And what happens if you put the diversion in? They plan 3 diversions, actually. So this is just analyzing one of them. So this shows you in year 50 on the low scenario, that is, I think the low scenario was like 1.5 feet of sea level rise. This is how much different the world is going to be if they implement their hardened solution. And you see there are some differences. There's a red area here that's salt marsh that's no longer area here. There's an area that's kind of created here that's no longer that's here. There are some differences, but not huge difference. But this is the low estimate of the difference after 50 years. But remember, the high estimate was 2.8 feet, which is actually low as an estimate. Here's what happens if you go to the high estimate. Now, one of the things you notice is most of the land is gone, but look at the difference between the left and the right. They're going to spend about $2 billion on this diversion. And here's going to be the difference, is you'll have a little area of brackish marsh as opposed to this. That's the $2 billion difference after 50 years. By the way, this is a totally unpopulated area down here where there's nothing but marsh now. So just going to North Carolina, where I spent the last 35 years at Duke Marine Lab, which is right here. It's a lovely place in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Gulf Stream comes right up here. Great fishing, good sailing, passable surfing. But here's the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the coast of Virginia. They come down here out to Cape Hatteras, Cape Lookout, and then down to Cape Fear by Wilmington. So here's what Gary Griggs, the East Coast Gary Griggs, thinks is going to happen in North Carolina in what he calls one generation, 25 to 40 years. Total banks in the Outer Bank barrier islands, which this is the highest energy wave environment in the North Atlantic Ocean. And one of the artifacts of that is, if you go back, you see there's a lot of land right here that is going to be inundated one way or the other by this chart. But if you look at Stan Riggs' chart, it's gone. That whole part of the peninsula was right here. And it's basically coming to an open bay. And this is the 200-year scenario, where the Outer Banks are totally, completely gone. And essentially, the Pamlico Sound, which is here, is an open bay. So that's the kind of prediction for North Carolina. And there are lots of, the area where I live will be gone. So the summary of the US, summary of Asia is long history of coastal armoring. They've kind of stopped doing it. And even some areas like the Netherlands has said, whoa, we're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to retreat essentially. The US built out like crazy, just like Europe did, even more, like San Francisco Airport. LA, I mean, LA used to be an estuary. Los Angeles, no, it now looks like the LA River. I put a river in long quotes, right? The LA drainage ditch, where Schwarzenegger rode his motorcycle, right, in that movie. So we did all that kind of stuff, just like Europe did in a concentrated area. But then we got religion and we stopped doing it. So now let's look at Asia. So historic concentrated development in Asia, many coastal towns, Hong Kong, Singapore, so on and so forth. Significant new top-down development these days. I'm going to show you some examples of that. New current building out into the ocean. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. And again, a relatively homogeneous cultures and political economies, mostly dominated these days by China and India. Okay, so here are the hot spots. And so this is the height above sea level now in meters. And one of the things you see, the darkest part here, which is right here, anybody know what that is and where that is and what it is? No? Hong Kong's way up here. This is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. It's where Robert Duvall famously landed his helicopters to go surfing, right? It's the Mekong Delta, that's where that is. And basically, it's some of the lowest land in the world, actually, as part of the major landmass of South Vietnam. And it's right at sea level now. And the hot spots I want to draw your attention to, so we're going to talk about a little bit about Bangladesh, not much, a bit about Singapore, which is right down here at the end of the Malay Peninsula, and then we're going to talk about a major city that's right in the area of this red hot spot. You know what city it is? Shanghai, absolutely, absolutely. Largest, depending on how you count it, Singapore and Shanghai, largest ports in the world. This just shows you the percentage of the population of each country which will be exposed at, I think it's 5 meters, it says, at 5 meters of sea level rise. And what you see here is that in the case of Vietnam, over 20% of the Vietnamese population is at risk, okay, with that amount of sea level. And as you see, it's true up here with Thailand and this area of China here too. Okay, so you look at Bangladesh for a while. This is basically the whole country is in a bad color of one kind or the other here. And I'm going to show you some pictures of an area that's right here called Chittagong, right on the eastern side. This is Myanmar over here. So the whole country, billions of people literally are going to be moving from Bangladesh to somewhere currently unknown and under considerable dispute. So here's what that coast looks like there. Mostly small fishing communities. This is an aquaculture, or this is a dip net, a traditional farming or fishing technique in the rivers and estuaries there. This is aquaculture here, where they've closed it off and they're growing the fish in here and harvesting them in these little dugouts. Relatively low technology area, lots of small villages, lots of very poor people without resources. But it also has things like this. You know what this is? It's the shipbreakers, that's right. It's where old ships go to die. And it's this long, flat area here where the ships with flat bottoms here just sit on the bottom until these guys, literally by hand, go out and cut them apart and drag all the parts back to shore with these long cables like this. It's a major industry. That whole area is going to be underwater up to about here, probably by the end of the next century. So this is an example of a very poor, undeveloped area, but with lots of people that is going to have the same problem we've been talking about here. Now here are two different examples. The first of three. This is the Incheon Airport. Some of you may have flown into this in South Korea. It's relatively new. It's rated along with Singapore as one of the top airports in the world. They're lovely airports consistently. But they built it out into the ocean in the last decade. This is the airport here, and it's connected to the land by this long bridge here. And this is it. It's a very nice, new, modern airport. But there were two islands here that they basically filled in between and all around to make this airport. And they're very proud of it. And my point is, they not only tried to harden shoreline, they built new land, significant new land, out in the ocean. That's a very different way of looking at what you use the ocean for, compared to, I think, the way we do it here. And by the way, I don't mean to say any of these are better or worse or good or bad. They're just different based on the way the people in these places perceive of their relationship with the coast and the ocean. That's my point. Now here is the country of Singapore. And this is right at the end of the Malay Peninsula. This is the Strait of Johor here. This is so, you can almost throw a rock across the Strait of Johor. There are lots of mosques in Johor Bahru, which is the major city here. We spent time in the marshes. I took a class, Duke class, for 6 weeks a year for 15 years in a row to Singapore, so I spent a lot of time there. And if you were up in the marshes up here, you can hear the evening prayers from Johor Bahru if the wind's right across the Strait of Johor. It's very close. And it's 225 square miles, but there are 5.5 million people in Singapore. It's an independent nation, but it's only been independent from Britain. It was a crown colony since 1964. And Singapore now, and this is the point I want to make, is 25% larger in terms of land area than it was in 1964 when it became a country. And the reason is all the basically light and white areas you see here, this is the port of Singapore here, and a major oil processing place here. This is the Changi Airport, the nice new airport in Singapore here. This is all land expansion, where they also have gone out into the ocean. Now this raises an interesting problem because, as some of you may know, that every country can claim 200 nautical miles as an exclusive economic zone. Well, in countries that are very close to each other, basically you split the difference. So there's a line that ran kind of down the middle of the river here between the US and Malaysia. But when they built the Changi Airport, the Singaporeans said, oh, now that we built the airport out in the ocean, we're just going to move the line toward you guys. And Malaysia said, no, you're not. And it's still in court, actually, at the moment. So that raises interesting questions. This is a road, a coastal road that goes right along this part right here out to the airport. This is a road they've recently raised 5 feet. They're thinking ahead about sea level rise. Now, Singapore is an interesting place because they need to be water independent, and they're not. They recycle 100% of their domestic wastewater and all of their stormwater runoff, all of which they collect because they've engineered to do it, back into drinking water, into drinkable water. Okay? And it's, by any test and treatment standards, it's the cleanest water in the world. And they have a desal plant. They just opened a new one. But they've done this in part by closing off all their estuaries and rivers. So this is something called Marina Barrage. This used to be, it's still the Singapore River. There used to be a sampan city of thousands of sampans that people lived on up in the Singapore River. It was quite a mess, and so in the 80s, they kicked them all out and put this barrage in, which closes off the Singapore River. This is now a freshwater reservoir. This is salt water from the Straits of Malacca. This is freshwater here. And if you look at these lines here, this is on the very undeveloped western side of the island. All of these estuaries, which are mangrove estuaries, mangrove forests here, they have enclosed all of these as part of collecting the stormwater runoff. The middle of the island is very high. There's a reservoir here, but it's probably 2,000 feet, something like that. And it's a rainforest reserve, actually, except for the reservoir in the middle of it. There are wild monkeys. It's great to go to Singapore and visit. Just don't put your backpack down, because the monkeys right in your backpack. So they have, not only have they put the Marina Barrage in here at the Singapore River, but they have enclosed all of their estuaries and rivers with basically these dikes like this. And so all these mangroves will actually go away at some point, or at least the more freshwater adaptable species will come to dominate over the saltwater species from the Straits of Malacca. And you know, when I talk to people in Singapore, they often would come up and ask me, you know, we know you do work on sea level rise, Mike. Should we be worried about that? And I say, well, you know, like the Germans in Emden, for entirely different reasons, because you wanted to become water independent, you've kind of inured yourself to a couple of meters of sea level rise with all your hardening of your, now that has not come at no cost to your natural environment, but for other political economic reasons, you've really hardened your shoreline and built your harbor so that it's probably fine for 2 to 3 meters. And you can deal with that in your country. So you're probably set okay, actually, in Singapore, for, again, an entirely different set of reasons. But they have a sea level rise plan, in effect. They, in my experience working in most parts of the world, Singapore and the Netherlands are the best planners ever. I mean, they plan, and they plan decades ahead of time. The Netherlands, because they're so low as planning retreat, for other reasons, Singapore is engineering their way out of at least the first century of this problem. Okay? All right, now we get to Shanghai, which is a different question because it's in that big red, blackish area up in northeastern China that I showed you on the map before. And this is the city of Shanghai. Now, it's not very high above mean sea level right now. This is the main city of Shanghai. So they're in trouble for that reason in the city. But again, looking at the mentality and looking into the future, how they're looking at their future at the coast, Shanghai is one of the fastest expanding cities in the world as well. And so here's the city of Shanghai here. Here is the beginning of a long bridge that goes out to, guess what? A new port, a deep water port they've just built out in the South China Sea. Well, it's not the South China Sea anymore, it's too far north of that, but out into the ocean, essentially. And again, like in Chan, they took 2 small islands and basically filled in between them and around them to do it. So the part of the reason they're the largest port in the world, along with Singapore, is that they also are building, now they call this reclaimed land. In no living memory was there land out there. This is not reclaimed land. It's claiming the ocean. It's making the ocean into land. Something that, again, for better or worse, we stopped doing all of a sudden a long time ago. But this is a good question about what the publics care about. Now in China, you've probably heard about the air pollution problem. And because even the citizenry in the big cities in China are so concerned, they're actually starting to do something about their air quality. But this is how they look at the ocean. It's where we put airports, the way we did when we built San Francisco Airport. Okay? And again, not better or worse, it's just different. And so the question becomes, what are the implications of that difference? Here's another shot of the port. These are huge ports, and Singapore and Shanghai go back and forth about who's the biggest, depending on whether you judge number of ships, tonnage of ships, or actual cargo shipped. And they go kind of up and down on those things over time, compete with each other. We're way behind, by the way. So our coast will be moving. There's no question. Most of our people and infrastructure will be moving with them at some point. We will defend some areas, but not most areas. And I say to a lot of small towns and cities, you better get your assistance from the federal government now on this issue, because when the sea level gets to 1 meter, you're going to hear a huge sucking sound of federal money going to big cities. It ain't going to be coming to Long Beach, and it ain't going to be coming to Santa Cruz, California, where I live, or South Louisiana, except for the Port of New Orleans. Major decisions, defend or abandon, although the future is clear in terms of direction. The timing's uncertain. We don't, I guess, know how fast it's going to happen. That's an unknown at the moment. The time frame is beyond critical political cycles. No politician who's in office now is going to be in office when this all really starts to happen in 20 or 30 years. That's a political problem for us. We lack the law and policy tools. Remember back in the beginning? So we don't have the policies to deal with this. And of course, some people who shall remain nameless, they live in the White House, don't believe any of this, right? So, all right, so my conclusions. We will not, in fact, defend all of our coasts. No matter whether we defend or not, we should immediately start, as Jerry said, to plan for what we pretty much suspect the future is going to look like. Provision for our new natural infrastructure included where our marshes and estuaries going to move to. You know, in Southwest Florida, where they have wonderful marshes and mangrove swamps down in the Bay of Florida and the Keys there, a lot of the upland area adjacent to them, where the natural infrastructure, marshes, would move and has historically moved as sea level's gone up and down, there's still open area. Now, some areas, we've developed it so much that there's no room for them to move. But there are areas, I keep telling this to Nature Conservancy, stop buying current salt marsh. Stop getting rights to current salt marsh. Get rights to the upland area next to the salt marsh. They won't do it yet. They won't do it yet, yeah. And the biggest problem, I predict, is provision for dealing with inundated infrastructure. What are we going to do when, in fact, Lower Manhattan is underwater and useless? What do we do with it? Right? So the big question is, will we be proactive or reactive? And Deborah's going to tell you in a minute how California, as a cultural group, is now looking at this. But I just couldn't resist. Last weekend, I was watching the Washington March on TV, and the young woman, whose name I forget because I'm too old, young singer, popular singer, ended it by singing "The Times They Are Changed" in the Dylan song. And so I went back and I looked at the words. Why don't you take a minute to read through this, and especially look at the underlined areas. Admit that the waters around you have grown. If your time to you is worth saving, that you better start swimming, I inserted moving, or you'll sink like a stone, for the times. Good. Thank you very much.
So now you're going to hear from one of the most important people in the state of California, because Deborah's the executive director of the Ocean Protection Council. She has a whole army of scientists in her science advisory team that help her out. And then we've got the California Ocean Science Trust. And so Deborah is going to describe to us how we do things here in California. Deborah.
Thank you, Jerry, for the introduction. Again, my name is Deborah Halberstadt. I'm the Executive Director of the California Ocean Protection Council. I'm also the Deputy Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Policy in the Natural Resources Agency. I'm going to talk tonight, I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts. The first is just a basic introduction to what OPC is and what we do. And I think it'll be interesting to contrast to what you just heard about South Korea and Singapore and Shanghai in terms of how we look at our oceans in California policy. The second part, I'm going to be talking about our recently adopted sea level rise guidance document. So the California Ocean Protection Council last Wednesday adopted an updated guidance document that's supposed to guide state and local approaches towards sea level rise in their planning. And then the last section, I'm going to talk about what can we do in light of this tremendous change that we are facing. The times are changing, and how are we going to adapt to that? What can we do? And so one of the ideas is thinking about how can we finance change? If we have to think about managed retreat, if we have to think about moving, if we have to think about natural infrastructure like you heard about last week, I think from Sarah Newkirk, how do we pay for that? So those are the 3 sections. Let's see. So to start with, this is an org chart of the California state government. I am in the blue box. So this is a cabinet level state policy body that directs ocean policy. We were created in statute through the California Ocean Protection Act, and we're nested within the California Natural Resources Agency. So we are essentially the ocean program for the Resources Agency. Because of our position in this kind of massive bureaucracy, we have a straight line to the governor's office. So right there, the little blue line. And that enables me to serve as a policy advisor to the governor and also to the legislature. We have a council that's made up of 7 members. So we have the Secretary of Natural Resources, who is also the chair. He's also my boss. We have Cal EPA, Secretary Rodriguez, the chair of the State Lands Commission, who right now is Controller Yee. It alternates between the controller and the lieutenant governor at the State Lands Commission. And then we have 2 legislative members who are ex officio, and we have 2 public members. We also have a science advisory team that was created in statute along with the California Ocean Protection Council. And that body is comprised of some of the most preeminent, renowned scientists in the state, if not the country, if not the world, I would say. And we are able to turn to them for advice on a panoply of issues. Whatever policy question we have, we want guided by the best available science. And so we turn to our science advisors to help us understand that science. So our mission is up here, ensuring healthy, resilient, and productive ocean and coastal ecosystems in California. And this, again, I would say contrasts a bit with what you saw about building airports or ports into the ocean. We try to look at how do we protect and conserve the ocean and its ecosystem. And we really think about it as an ecosystem as a whole, not kind of a species by species approach, which has been taken in the past and is still taken at places like Department of Fish and Wildlife, which really is thinking about how do you deal with stock management. We're thinking on a whole ecosystem more holistically. So in order to achieve our mission, we work at the intersection of science, policy, and management. And we coordinate activities of state agencies to really try to break down the silos that can develop among state agencies. We try to, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we try to ensure that the best available science informs policy and our management decisions. And then we provide recommendations to the governor and to the legislature to protect our coast and ocean ecosystems. One of the ways that we're able to do this is through providing financial support through grant making to support really innovative research that can inform and improve the stewardship of our coast and ocean. I'm having trouble with this. There we go. Okay. So I'm not going to linger on any of our other priority programs because today is really about sea level rise, but we do focus on several other issues. So we've got climate change. Within our climate change program, we look across the board at a variety of climate change issues, but we definitely focus on sea level rise. Also, ocean acidification is a big topic there. Our marine protected areas, California has the largest marine protected network in the country. We look at marine pollution, so issues like plastics, microplastics, chemicals of emerging concern. We look at sustainable fisheries and how to continue to improve them. And then we have emerging issues like wind power offshore, aquaculture, some of the other things I think you may have touched on in other classes. Throughout all of these, I would argue that climate change plays an increasingly important and critical role. And so within each one of these, we think about them through the lens of climate change. And so I think we really play a unique role in integrating scientific, executive, and legislative action to protect our ocean and coast. And we, these 4 bullets are kind of what we spend our days focusing on and thinking about. So that's the end of part 1. Moving on to part 2. This is our sea level rise guidance document, which I brought a prop. If anyone wants to see the actual sea level rise guidance document in print as opposed to online, I have it here tonight. And this sea level rise guidance document was catalyzed by a request from Governor Brown. Actually, like 2 days before I started my job, I got a call saying, I want to understand what's going on with sea level rise, because a couple of reports had come out in the newspaper, in the New York Times, saying there was this issue with ice melt and how, so he wanted to know, how does this affect California? What does the change in ice melt research mean for California? So we spent over a year developing this policy guidance. It has 3 main components, which are the updated projections based on the best available science. So we moved from using a scenario-based approach to a probabilistic-based approach. I can get into that in more detail if people are curious, but it's a different way of looking and analyzing the problem. We developed a stepwise approach for evaluating projections and their associated risks, and we integrated this notion of adaptation pathways. This is pretty groundbreaking for policy making, but it's exciting and it's bold. And then we developed some recommended adaptation strategies. Okay, I'm going to get into that in the next part. So the governor issued an executive order, B-3015, which required state agencies to incorporate sea level rise at the state level into planning. At the same time, there were 2 different pieces of state legislation that required the incorporation of sea level rise into local planning. And there was also the creation of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program, affectionately called ICARP. And so all of these new requirements necessitated a new analysis to enable local and state agencies to do the analysis that they now were legally required to do. There was also this new research that I mentioned a moment ago addressing ice melts in both Greenland and West Antarctica, and how that is impacting the sea level, the change in sea level. And I imagine that when Gary Griggs was here, he spoke with you about this, but I will cover it really briefly. I also, by the way, I'm not a scientist. I actually am an anthropology major. So you got 2 anthropologists with you tonight. So this guidance, the rising seas in California, Gary Griggs was the lead author, along with Dan Cahan from Scripps. And we commissioned this study to, and the entire group was really an incredible source of information and knowledge, whether they were ice melt science. We had ice melt scientists, we had people who are experts in understanding risk and deep uncertainty. We had people who are experts in statistics and that whole area. I mean, it was a really phenomenal group of scientists, and we asked them to analyze and to synthesize the most current and best available science to really lay the foundation for our policy guidance. And so their study, this Rising Seas document, included advances in both sea level rise modeling and an improved understanding of ice melt in Greenland and West Antarctica, and the potential contribution of that ice melt to sea level rise. It turns out California is really in a bad place when it comes to ice melt from West Antarctica. Given the rotation of the Earth and issues that I don't pretend to understand, the geomorphology, all of the ice melt starts to pool towards California. So it's not ideal. This is just a little brief overview of the type of engagement that we hosted in order to develop our sea level rise guidance document. So we had listening sessions around the state, we conducted interviews, we held public workshops, we did presentations and meetings and webinars. We had our guidance document provided to the public, and there was a 30-day public comment period. There was a response and a webinar following that public comment period, because we really wanted to be sure that we were gathering all of the information that was out there and that we weren't developing a policy guidance that would fall on deaf ears or that people would reject. I mean, we want it to be taken up by state and local agencies and by communities and organizations. So we developed this 5-step approach. And I'm just going to walk through the steps. I don't know if it's too small for you to be able to read. But step 1 is to identify the nearest tide gauge. So there are 12 tide gauges throughout the state, and we requested that the scientists do the probabilistic projections for each one of the 12 tide gauges. And then we tried to say, well, if you live in between the 2 tide gauges, this is how you interpolate or extrapolate from those numbers, because it does make a difference. I mean, it's not, our coast is not uniform. California is not a uniform coastline, and where you are geographically makes a difference in terms of how much sea level rise you will be seeing. The next step was to look at the project lifespan. So we want you to think about the geography and the timeline. Those are going to be kind of your 2 matrices. And unfortunately, I didn't include the table in my presentation, but it is in this book if you want to take a look at it at a break or afterwards. But we asked the scientists to provide us with a range of projections based on what's called the RCP. Have you become familiar with the notion of RCP? Okay. So we used the boundaries of RCP 2.6, which is the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction approach in the IPCC, and then the 8.5, which is the trajectory that we're on, which is the least aggressive, kind of business as usual. And so we used those as our bounds, kind of our outer bounds. And we said, when you are analyzing what type of sea level rise you need to plan for, you need to look across time and across space under both of those RCPs and look at that entire range. So this was a huge change from how most engineers and most cities and most state agencies wanted to address sea level rise. They really wanted a single number. And we said, we can't give you a single number. Not only can we not give you a single number, we're going to give you a huge range. And we're going to ask you to really do a thoughtful analysis and think through the risk and think through what it is that you need to plan to and how you're going to adapt. So we said up to 2050, because, as Mike mentioned earlier, all of the sea level rise is already baked in, you have to plan to RCP 8.5, so you have to plan to the higher level. After 2050, and I think Mike would probably say we should have gone up to 2100 for that, but that would not have been politically feasible, I don't think. So post 2050, you can look at this range across 2.6 and 8.5. You also, when you're looking past 2050, if you have a structure that you're building that is critical or that could impact public health and human safety, you need to consider what we call the H++ ice melt scenario. So the H++ ice melt scenario is significantly higher than anything. I mean, the 2 meters discussion, it does not include ice melt. So in San Francisco, I can just give you an example. Let me turn to the table, which I'm really wishing I had provided for you. So in San Francisco, if you're looking at 2100 and you're looking at a low emission scenario, but high, like medium to high risk aversion project, you're looking at 5.7 feet. If you're looking at the high emissions scenario, it would be 6.9 feet. And if you're looking at the H++ extreme risk aversion analysis, that's 10.2 feet. So it's just complete, it's a whole order of magnitude different in terms of your analysis. But it's a really important component to consider. And not surprisingly, many local jurisdictions like San Francisco did not want us to include the H++ scenario in our report because it means that they have to start planning their large infrastructure projects to a much higher level than they were anticipating. So that would be step 3. And then step 4, you're supposed to evaluate the potential impacts and adaptive capacity across this range. So not just the impacts, but how are you going to adapt if you're wrong? And step 5 is you select your sea level rise projections based on your risk tolerance. And if necessary, develop these adaptation pathways. So as Mike mentioned, all of the numbers keep going up. Every time the guidance comes out and they say, okay, it's going to be 3 feet, and then the next time around it's going to be 3.5 feet, and then it's going to be 4 feet. You don't want to be planning your developments to only be able to tolerate 3 feet. You need to be able to adapt so that when you're wrong, because we will be wrong, and the science is going to continue to evolve, we need to be able to change. And so make sure that you have these triggers built in, that if you build a building and it floods 3 times, you will take this particular action. Or, there are a variety of different ways of thinking about triggers, and this is becoming a more popular policy approach with the Coastal Commission and with the State Lands Commission, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, all of which we worked with really closely. So we're all kind of moving in this direction of adaptation pathways and triggers. So the next part of our analysis was, it's not enough to just think through your projections. You need to be thinking about how you're going to adapt. And in addition, there are particular issues that you need to have in mind as you're making your analysis. As you're going through that framework, there are certain questions we really want folks to be thinking about. One is social equity. So vulnerable communities are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. And some of the issues that they face are going to be exacerbated by sea level rise. There's just a host of questions around that. And so we want the local governments and permitting agencies to really think that through. One issue that kind of came to light for me was this notion of toxic sites. So if you remember back to Hurricane Harvey, one of the problems that they experienced in Houston was as the hurricane came in and as the streets were flooded, many of the industrial sites released plumes of toxic material. And that was devastating to the environment and to public health. And so you often have toxic sites, Superfund sites, industrial facilities in communities of color, in disadvantaged communities. And we need to be thinking about how we can address that before the problem happens, before they get flooded. How are we going to make sure that those toxic sites are not releasing plumes into the environment? And I'll come back to that in part 3 of the presentation. Oh, which is right here. Look at that. So the guidance document is the first step. It's meant to be a living document that will be continually updated and also represents the first step in how the Ocean Protection Council is addressing sea level rise. We want to be thinking about what are the opportunities, and an optimistic policy speech. What are the opportunities for us to do more work? What are the challenges? Where can we take action to facilitate implementation of the guidance and to facilitate adaptation more generally? So there are 2 primary steps that we're looking at. One is outreach to state and local entities, and the other is funding. And so I think, just pausing for a moment, the guidance document is a bold approach, and that is paramount to how we look at current and anticipated, the current and anticipated severity of climate change impacts on California's coast and ocean, and the implications for long-term health and sustainability of our communities and of our marine environment. It represents a real and immediate threat, and it requires strong and thoughtful leadership. And so as we look at our next steps and our outreach options, we're going to be working with our state partners and our local and regional partners. So from a state partnership perspective, we'll be convening what's called the Coastal and Ocean Climate Action Team. We'll be convening the Sea Level Rise Action Team. We'll be working with our state partners as they develop their permitting guidelines and their regulatory approaches in order to incorporate the science and the policy guidance from this document across the state and across different agencies. At a local level, we want to host workshops, working sessions, meet with mayors, meet with local permitters, and understand first, what are the challenges to implementing this? Because this is not an easy document to implement. Like I said, we decided not to give a single number. We decided to make people think about ranges. We decided to make them think about triggers and adaptation and pathways, and that's really hard. This is not an easy problem to solve, and it's not so easy to just say you have to move. If you're a city and you have certain jurisdictional boundaries, saying, well, you're just going to have to pick yourself up and move is going to be a political challenge, an economic challenge, and a reality challenge in some cases. Where do you move to? I mean, I was just in the city of Pacifica last weekend, and I don't know if any of you have been to Pacifica, but it's a very long, narrow city right on the coast. It's crumbling into the ocean as we speak, and I don't know that it has any place to move. So the people who live there, the economies that live there, the industry that lives there is going to have to find another home, within probably 30 to 40 years, if not sooner in Pacifica. I don't know. I don't have an easy answer for how they need to do that, but it's what they're going to need to be thinking about. So the question is there a role, and what is the role for the state to catalyze implementation of the sea level rise guidance document? And the easy answer is money. that kind of greases the wheels, right? So the state can provide funding, but it can't afford to fund all of the necessary adaptation projects through grants alone. That will be billions, if not trillions of dollars. So we need to think about additional funding mechanisms. There are options like green bonds, like resilience bonds, like loans. And so I've been thinking from the perspective of OPC, from the Ocean Protection Council, we don't have a lot of money. We have some money. We tend to give out grants in the range of, $300,000, $400,000, $1 million. We don't really give out the $300 million or the $6 billion, I think, that San Francisco needs for its seawall. So I've been trying to brainstorm what can OPC do. And the concept that I'm working with right now is the possibility of a revolving loan fund. So the revolving loan fund would enable low-income, disadvantaged communities to implement some of the adaptation measures that they may have planned for already in preparing for climate change. We would seed the fund, and then we would seek public, private, and philanthropic partners. And our initial goal would be to create a $20 million fund. And we would be focusing on coastal adaptation projects related specifically to sea level rise and to coastal flooding, with the hope that the fund could be scaled up both financially and geographically so that climate change could be addressed throughout the state. Because just to note, sea level rise is not the only climate change issue affecting the state and affecting people's livelihoods. We have to think about heat islands. We have to think about drought. And so the OPC's fund obviously could not fund all of those projects. but if we could create a fund that grows in scope and in finance, I think that would be beneficial to the state and to the communities who would benefit. So the fund would be structured like a program-related investment fund. I don't know if any of the folks here are familiar with financial instruments like this, but a PRI is a loan that's made in pursuit of a charitable mission rather than to generate income. So it's a popular instrument that's used by philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation or Packard Foundation, Rockefeller, Ford, and they use PRIs to invest for impact rather than for profit. So they support programs, and the reason I have these pictures here is the Packard Foundation supported the creation of a freshwater trust, and the Gates Foundation supported guaranteeing public agencies' purchase of vaccines. So these are things that do public good. And we would seek to leverage resources by collaborating with private investors or philanthropies, such as the folks I just mentioned, for-profit entrepreneurs, and state and local agencies. And the California Investment Bank has expressed interest in working with us and in partnering with us. And they've actually expressed interest in potentially administering the fund, which is incredibly exciting to me. It's a really fantastic opportunity because they have experience managing these types of programs, and the Ocean Protection Council does not. We manage things like fisheries and marine protected areas, not large loan programs. So what types of projects would be eligible? And who would be eligible? So again, I mentioned previously, I would really like to target low-income communities of color, native nations who have been and will continue to be overburdened by pollution and climate change. Impacts such as increased flooding, damage to homes, roads, damage to public transportation, destruction of coastal sacred places. All of these types of things will disproportionately affect those communities, and this revolving loan fund would provide financial assistance to help the communities adequately plan for and implement adaptation measures. What types of projects would be eligible? I would say consistent with our sea level rise guidance document, we would prioritize two main categories. One is long-term adaptive solutions, and one is more acute short-term solutions. So long-term adaptation solutions would include natural solutions for shoreline protection, preservation or restoration of dunes or wetlands, managed retreat options that allow shorelines to migrate inland, restoration of wetlands, preservation of public access, and addressing, and this is one thing I didn't mention in the earlier part of the presentation, but addressing episodic increases in sea level rise caused by storms and other extreme events. It's really important to keep in mind that the rise in sea level does not even come close to what people will experience on the coast. When you think about the impacts of El Nino events, of storm surges, when we talk about sea level rise, it's the global mean sea level rise. It's not what you're going to experience on the coast, which could be, 20 feet at times. So I definitely think that that's an important part of the equation. And then again, the acute public health and safety threats or environmental threats. This goes back to what I just mentioned about the impacts from Hurricane Harvey, really getting us to start thinking about what do we do with industrial or Superfund sites to make sure that they're adequately protected. How do we prevent contaminated water from polluting the waterways, coast, and ocean? How do we ensure redundancy for public safety related infrastructure? Those are all types of projects that I think would be good to fund through this type of revolving loan fund. So how could we get more money? How can the revolving loan fund be stacked against other funding sources? So again, we would follow that PRI model, and we would provide minimum loans. We'd charge a low interest rate. We would probably require some sort of cost share. And this is all, this starts getting into pretty political, thorny areas. If we go to public utility or municipal utilities and say, we want you to partner with some of these communities who are going to be applying for loans, but they can't necessarily pay back the loan. Can you partner with them? Can you underwrite? Can you provide some sort of guarantee so that we know that it will be paid back over time? We envision collaborating with other state agencies that already provide grants. So, for example, the State Coastal Conservancy funds quite a bit of grants for restoring wetlands, for restoring marshes, and conserving coastal areas. Can we partner with them and leverage some of those projects so that we have local buy-in through the revolving loan fund in addition to the grants that are already being distributed? So the challenges, I think the primary challenge that I ask myself, and I get asked a lot, is how are low-income communities going to pay back these loans? And I think that's a really fair question. Unless we can identify clear sources of revenue, should we be thinking about this as a grant program instead? And I don't know the answer to that. I want to hold workshops with local governments to find out, is this something that you would use? Is this something, given the problems that are facing your community, you have a lot of immediate problems. This is more long-term. It's hard to think long-term when you're on a constant hamster wheel of election cycles. Is this something that you would even use? And I don't know the answer to that. So that's kind of the first step. And then the second step is, if you were interested in using it, how would you be able to pay back the loan? And so we're going to be having workshops and meeting with local governments to understand this a little bit better. But that's obviously, if a loan isn't going to work, then we should think about a different option. We could require that neighborhoods or community organizations partner with larger entities, as I mentioned. We could look for projects that have some nexus with for-profit entrepreneurs and businesses. There are a lot of different creative solutions, but it's definitely a sticking point to the success of the program. The second challenge or obstacle is whether we would need authority to successfully operate the fund. So OPC's founding legislation, the California Ocean Protection Act, does allow us to create revolving loan funds, although it's in the context of creating revolving loan funds to support sustainable fisheries. Could we use that authority and translate that over here to climate change, or would that be pushing our authority too far? And do we need to work with the legislature to augment our authority? And the last challenge is whether we could find someone to administer the program statewide, because as I mentioned, we're a small team. I have 10 staff. We're not capable of administering this type of program. And fortunately, the California Investment Bank has already expressed significant interest in doing that for us. So that challenge, I'm hoping I can kind of check off, check that box. So that is the end. I'm happy to answer questions now. I don't know if we're going to take a break. Okay, thank you very much.